Bonjour mes amis, bienvenue à notre classe de l'histoire du mondial. I don't know. French. That is a language. Am I going to include this in the actual final video? Probably. So let's get on to something I guess that's much less lighthearted, which is European imperialism. It's actually not just going to be European, it's also going to be Japanese and American, but we're going to focus on the Europeans. So, this is something that the West has had to a lot of shame over. And it's like, it's the West's dirty underwear. It's also Japan's extra dirty underwear. But I guess you'll kind of see why. So, here's the areas that we're going to be talking about. There is imperialism for the Americas, for example, like, taking over the Native Americans and also taking over the Philippines. But yeah, we don't have infinite time. Even though I have turned a 40-minute lecture into something that's probably going to be approaching an hour and 20 minutes at this point. But anyways, let's go. All right. So essentially, what imperialism is, let's say you're Belgian and you don't have enough diamonds, you don't have enough steel, you don't have enough minerals, you don't have enough rubber in order to, supply what your population wants. So what you do to get these resources is, rather than trade with other people, you go over to another place and then you conquer it. You take it over and then you just basically just milk that place dry of all of its resources. And in the process of milking that place dry, you're probably going to end up killing a large part of the population and fighting a lot of wars. Because imperialism is extremely messy. So the I kind of went into like that economic thing, but remember, the a lot of European societies or Western societies are very capitalist, so they want to make as much money as possible. So the best way to make as much money as possible is to get land for very cheap, and then like find resources on that land, and then sell those for a huge profit. And what I mean by get land for very cheap is obviously just to send the army there and to clear out anyone who already lives there, probably by force. Uh, and then make money off of that. But there's also a lot of imperialist states. There's Spain, but we had kind of talked about Spain losing their colonies when we were talking about the Wars of Independence. There's well, there was Spain. There's Britain, because sun never sits on the British Empire. There's France, there's Belgium, and Germany and Italy are also going to get into the game once they become countries. There's also Russia, but we saw how well that went for Russia last time, and the Russians aren't going to get into like India and Africa. And so all these states, imperial states, they want to compete with each other. They want to say that they're the best state. And the way to do that is to paint the map your color by taking over as much territory as possible. Um, and if you can say that, okay, we are the biggest empire, then you have a lot of national pride that way. That's why British people had so much pride about having the world's biggest empire, though eventually that became something that you don't really want to brag about. And also, making a lot of money through this means you can pay for big armies that you can use to kill other Europeans. Because you're fighting other Europeans is the European national past, or I guess European continental pastime. Uh, and for France, it's overthrowing the government. But anyways, I'm getting really distracted for this one. Anyways, the Europeans, they justify imperialism by saying that that they're actually doing a service to the world, that they are actually helping spread civilization and Christianity and saving the souls of all these half monkeys, which is basically how they see anyone who's not European, um, and giving them the gift of being able to be European. Though, what they're really giving them is giving the gift of being dead, which isn't exactly the nicest gift. Because the Europeans run into people who don't want to be European, because obviously they're not Europeans. They want to keep their own culture, they want to keep their own traditions, they want to keep their lives. And the Europeans are happy to relieve them of all of those things, because the Europeans have access to a little thing you might have heard of. It's called the machine gun. Um, right here is a Gatling gun, which is like an early machine gun. But in the 1890s, the Europeans are going to get access to this thing called the Maxim gun, which is the first machine gun as like the first widely used machine gun as we know machine guns. Um, and European armies, like the German army in the 1890s, are going to be able to fight natives. Like they're going to use a few hundred European soldiers versus several thousand native soldiers, and they're going to just be able to shoot them to pieces without losing any of their own soldiers with machine guns. Before machine guns, they just had powerful rifles and artillery that could shoot at you from miles away. And so, yeah, just the Europeans have a very big technological advantage over people that they're conquering. Um, so, so the we're gonna start with talking about India, and no one remembered the Mughals from last time. Though one person asked the Mongols if the Mughals were the Mongols. The Mughals are not the Mongols, even though they sound very similar. But the Mughals, they were the empire from last week, I think, and they were Muslims who controlled large parts of northern India. When the British arrive in India, the Mughals are starting to fall apart because, well, they're a bunch of Muslims ruling over mainly Hindus. They're not exactly doing a very good job of keeping the Hindus happy. And that leads and then combined with the Mughals just like not really like with their government just starting to decay, um, they're fracturing. And what the British get to do is they get to insert themselves into all these like political fights for dominance, and they get to be like, okay, we're going to help you fight another Indian ruler in exchange if you just give us a little bit of land and maybe some like nice trading privileges, things like that. And well, these Indian rulers, since they don't think that the British are too much of a threat yet, since they don't know what's coming, they ally with the British, and they take out other Indian rulers. And then when all these Indian rulers are weak enough, then the British can arrive with a big army and just take over. Um, and the reason why this is so easy for the British to do this is one, because the British initially in India do a really bad job. Like when they fight the Indians early on, or like various Indian groups early on, they actually lose really badly. And so, so now that if they're not a threat, then all these Indian groups can go to start fighting each other. And also, none of these Indian groups identify as Indians. We've met the Mughals already, so they're thinking of themselves as Mughals. But then there's also like people in the south, the Marathi. They're and people are identify themselves as like parts of each of these individual like smaller states and kingdoms, not as Indians. And so that means that there isn't that no one really thinks of allying with other Indians against the British because they don't feel like they have things in common with other Indians. This is part of what the British call divide and conquer, because it's way easier to take over a place if the locals are fighting each other instead of you. But the thing is though is that the British company, actually this is really weird because when the British take over India, they're not doing it as the British. They're doing it through a company, a private corporation called the British East India Company. And the British East India Company is really corrupt. And after they've taken over India, they actually start doing a very bad job of it. And so most of the British soldiers in India are actually not British. They're Indians. They're called sepoys. Um, and so sepoys are soldiers taken from higher castes. Remember, like castes, the caste system is how Indian society is organized. So basically, like the British recruit soldiers from the upper class, and so these soldiers expect to be respected, but the British don't respect them very much. Uh, like sepoys are forced to have European officers. Like you can't have sepoy officers except very rarely. Um, and the final straw comes when in 1857, when the soldiers, the sepoys, they're Muslims and Hindus, but they get told by the British that they're gonna get some new cartridges. Cartridges are things that hold bullets. And in order to open the cartridge, you have to bite it with your teeth and then pull. But these cartridges, uh, they're water. They need to be waterproof, so they're covered in grease. And this grease is made from the grease of pigs and of cows. And, Muslims, they can't eat pork, and a lot of Hindus can't eat cows, and so that's uh, that they don't want to they don't want to bite into those cartridges. And then the British are just like, get over it. And then the soldiers are like, no, we can't do that. And so instead of being, respectful and all that, the British say, okay, we're going to make cartridges that don't involve like, beef and or well, cow and pig grease. But until then, you have to bite into these or else. And the soldiers are like, no, we can't do that at all. This is our religion. And so then instead of like accepting that and letting them just use the ammunition, the bullets they were using before, with older guns, the British take the people who are arguing against them, then they imprison them, or they tie them to cannons and have them blown to pieces. So pretty much immediately, all of the sepoys are like, dude, that is not chill. That is not allowed. And so there is a massive rebellion for the British East India Company's army. It gets destroyed, or like it gets put down by soldiers brought in from Britain, but as well as some like other sepoys too. But that tells the British government that they can't trust the East India Company anymore, and so they just set up the British Raj, which just means direct British rule over India by the government. so, so the British control of India is kind of okay. There's a lot of like debate, I guess, about the merits of British rule in India, but to me it seems like pretty pretty negative. Because so like just because like let's think of the positives that the British bring. The British bring Western technology. Remember we talked about the sanitary revolution, and that's super good. They bring in railroads. Those are great because they help you transport things. Um, I but here's the thing: most of the things that the British bring in are made to help white people. They don't use them to help to help Indians. For example, like a lot of like Indian cities, they don't really get the sanitation or like any of like sewers or things like that that the British are building back in like London. Also, the railroads, all these like railroads are built between either British military bases or ports and like companies and mines and stuff that are all owned by British people. There's very little stuff that's dedicated to actually serving Indians. And when Indians do actually get to use the trains, they have to sit in special carriages or like that are worse than the ones given to British people. They have to like get off the train or something or like get out of their seats if British people want a seat. It's very similar to like segregation in the United States. Um, oh boy, and so yeah, it's a lot of it just doesn't really help Indians. At least not until the British like get driven out way later. Um, there also is an increase in population when the British take over India, but the thing is, the Indian population was increasing before the British took over, and only that is that there are several points during, well, like under British rule, where the population growth just stops, and the whole reason for that is because the British don't care about Indians. They don't care if Indian farmers starve to death. What they want is for Indians to give them all these raw materials so they can send them back to Britain, turn those into goods, and then sell those at a profit. And that means that what they do is they use all these railroads in order to just transport cheap goods produced like by British factories all throughout India. And then since those goods are so cheap, those drive out all of the Indian artisans, people who are, tasked with, or people whose whole jobs and their whole livelihoods depend on them producing things. But when they're competing against something so much cheaper, there's no way they can keep their jobs. So that destroys like the economy in the large parts of India and forces most people, like 90% of people, in back into farming. Um, and so it means that now at this point, India needs Britain in order to survive because the British kind of destroyed India's economy or like manufacturing because now they need to buy British goods for everything. Um, Also, Indians aren't allowed to be part of the government. Like theoretically, Indians can join the government with like there's no official discrimination, but all of the tests to join the government are done in London. So you have to go all the way to London in order to take the test, and then you have to come all the way back. And you also, in order to take the test, you have to be a very specific age, meaning that like the travel times and things like that mean that like only one Indian actually manages to join the British government before 1914, or like through those tests. So they're being cut out of this. But also, just to talk about more about the Indian economy, is that the British want to make money from India, and what'll make you more money than producing food to support Indians is to produce cash crops and things like that to make money for British people. So in 1861, you have the start of the American Civil War, and in the South, in the South, the Confederacy, those people had been growing a lot of cotton. That's why they wanted slaves. And when the Civil War breaks out, there's like a blockade, so that the South can't get cotton to Britain. And so uh, so what the British do is they go to the Indian farmers, tell them to stop producing food, and then tell them to start producing cotton, and then have them, and so then that cotton can go to Britain. But then, so then they switch to cotton and they sell money. I mean, they sell cotton, get some money, some of which goes to the Indians, and the Indians then use some of that to buy food, though the food's a bit more expensive now. But then the American Civil War ends, and the cotton starts flowing into Britain again from the American South. And since there's more cotton now, the price of cotton drops, and now people can't afford food because one, cotton is now not selling for as much, and two, they haven't been making food. And there's a famine that kills millions of people. And during this entire famine, the British keep exporting food out of India. And they actually keep doing this over more than one famine, which is kind of an idea of just how much the British value Indian lives, as in they don't. Later on during World War One, we're going to see the British leading an Indian army where they throw the Indians at machine guns and like repeated attacks, which are suicide missions. And in the report by the general in charge of the army, the British general, he says that they shouldn't worry about the losses too much because they were only Indians. So, yeah. Um, Meanwhile, in China, we have the Qing dynasty. Remember, they're the Manchu, those people from the north who are taking over, but they're not the Mongols because China. Okay, I'm not going to try to confuse anymore. But anyways, the Qing, they are the people who closed China off. They don't want to modernize. They're very traditional, and so they um they have this group of people who want to reform India. They're called the self-strengthening movement. And what they want to do is they want to ensure that China can compete with the Europeans by making a modern army and building railroads, things like that. But after 100 days, another group in the government like takes over and then executes or imprisons or exiles the self-strengthening movement, which puts an end immediately to to any attempts to reform. And the reason behind this is because China's bureaucracy was starting to get really, really corrupt. They didn't want anything to change because that would mean they'd actually have to do something. Um, and that meant that when famine hits, when crop failure hits, the government actually just totally just mismanages the whole thing, and that's going to make people very angry. So later on, there's this guy who rebels, and he leads this thing called the Taiping Rebellion, and that kills I think like 20 million people on the low end. And China is continuing to basically just fall apart because they aren't adapting to what's happening around them. They still think that they're the best country in the world, that they're number one, but at this point, they're not. So, an example of how they're not are the Opium Wars, because the British are selling tons and tons of drugs that they're making in India to China. And China doesn't, or the Chinese government doesn't want this because you don't want your population to get hooked on drugs. That is bad. And so so the Chinese tell the British to stop, and then the British are like, "No, what are you going to do about it?" And so China declares war on the British, and they send their whole fleet to fight a very small British fleet, and the whole fleet just gets destroyed. The only British troops to actually get hurt during that battle are a few guys who got hurt when their cannons stopped working. The Chinese fleet was totally destroyed. Because remember, the British have a huge technological advantage over China because China's been shutting itself off. Also, because China is refusing to industrialize, and and so the Opium Wars. These are the Opium Wars. This happens more than once. But then at the end of the second Opium War, or actually one of the Opium Wars, China gives up Hong Kong to the British. And then all these other territories or all these other countries like, we should really get in on this. And so Germany gets a city, gets a city in eastern China. France also gets a city, or like parts, well, I mean, they get a bunch of southern China. And technically this isn't technically French or German or British territory, except for Hong Kong and the German city. But it's this like stuff you can see on the map right here. It's in sphere of influence, meaning that the British have like special privileges while they're in that territory. The French have special privileges over here. But it doesn't mean that China is officially losing that territory. Um, but then there's someone else. There's someone else who's joining in on this, and that's Japan, because they're seeing what's happening to China, and they don't want to do that. So as I talked about before, they industrialized, and then they use that industrialization to beat China. And so now it's not only Europeans who are beating up China, it's also other Asians, and not only other Asians, but also other Asians who had been closed off until the 1870s. So China at this point is humiliated. This is called the century of humiliation. And so since the Chinese are breaking down, This is paving the way for the eventual collapse of the Qing dynasty and the rise of the Republic of China, which we're going to be talking about next time. Also, I'm starting to get, I don't even know how to pronounce China at that moment. Okay, so here's the last two slides. This is Africa. And so after these wars of independence in the Americas, all of these states, these empires are looking elsewhere to be able to take over territory. And a great place to take over territory is Africa, because Africa has more natural resources than like any other place in the world. It is weirdly rich in resources. It is actually so rich in resources that it's kind of a curse, because now there's all these Europeans who are coming at it. And this is the deadliest race in human history, because the way that the Europeans treat the Africans is awful. And I mean, we talked about just the way the British treat the Indians, but the Europeans here are going to commit mass murder for the sake of getting diamonds, rubber, gold, things like that, like just materials to help fuel their economies. And so when the Europeans divide up Africa, they do it without any regard for what it actually looks like on the ground. You can see there are a lot of like straight lines for these borders. That's because none of these Europeans who are drawing these maps have ever been to any of the places they're dividing it up. They're just like splitting things. They're just drawing the straight lines and drawing things down the middle. And they don't really care if they're splitting up communities or splitting up families or splitting up ethnicities or things or languages. They just don't care. And so that's going to be part of an issue for why Africa today has so many conflicts, because there are all these different groups of people who don't like each other, who have been grouped together by the Europeans. Not only that, is that divide and conquer is still in effect. Like the British try to do or actually all the Europeans try to do as much as possible to divide different groups of Africans against each other so that they're easy to take over. And that's going to be a really big issue today, since there's so much conflict. The only states to get out of like colonization or imperialism are Liberia, though that's really just like an American colony, and Ethiopia, because Ethiopia manages to modernize enough in time to beat the Italians. So this slide was a bit is actually way too nice to the Europeans, because when it says that Africa was damaged economically, politically, and culturally, that does not encapsulate just the catastrophe for Africans that this was. Because we kind of mentioned it already, but yet again, the Europeans don't think the Africans are human beings, or if they are, or if they do, they don't care. All they want to do is make lots of money. And the way you do that, again, is by getting people away from making food and towards producing crops that can make you a lot of money. And chief among these things is rubber, which is something that is very valuable to this like newly industrializing economy in Europe. But the way the Europeans get rubber is horrifying. There is a reason why this slide has no photographs in it, because in the Congo alone, the Congo is Central Africa. That is where the Luba Empire lives, if you remember the Luba. And the Belgians, a tiny country that you might not be very familiar with, they kill 5 to 8 million people in the Congo alone. Remember, this is the Congo. There is much more Africa. 5 to 8 million people is if you killed everybody in San Diego and then everybody in LA and then some in the space of a lifetime. Because here's how they do it. So one, the Africans aren't producing food because the Europeans don't want them to. But two is the Belgians tell the Africans or the Congolese that, okay, look at these rubber trees. You have to collect, say, 40 pounds of rubber per day. And if you do not, we will cut your hands off, cut your feet off, and then leave you to starve to death. They do this to everybody, as in elderly people, like parents and children. And this is just the tip of the iceberg for just how brutal European colonization in Africa is. Because not only is like this whole rubber thing happening, but then this is like there are people being driven out of their land. There's mass murder. Like there was one point where like a few dozen British settlers were killed, and then in response, the British sent an army and killed tens of thousands of Africans who had nothing to do with the massacre. Um, there, there are photographs of what the British and the Belgians and the French and the Germans and the Italians have done in Africa that will give you nightmares. But yeah, this isn't even a nice but. But the Brit they do introduce railroads and telegraphs. I don't think that that's appropriate payment for what they're doing to the Africans, but they do introduce those things, mainly so that you can transport armies faster so that then they can get to work chopping kids' hands off. That is European colonization in Africa in a nutshell. And this is also why you hear so little about African history, because the Europeans crushed and destroyed so much of it, and they killed so many of the people whose job was to remember history. That is the extremely fun note that we're going to be ending this week off on. Thank you guys for sitting through, I know I made this much longer than it really has any right to be. Yeah, thank you so much though. This has been super fun, just teaching you guys. So thank you. Bye-bye.